Hi, Tom. Welcome to the show.
Hi, John. Great to be here.
Nice to have you. You've written a very interesting book, Moments in Time. It's all about music. And as you can tell, I like music. So I'm looking forward to hearing what it's all about. Tell us a little bit about yourself, where you are located, and your background, and how you got to write such a book like this.
Certainly. Well, right now, the last going on 40 years now, I live in Vancouver, British Columbia. Came out here in the September of 1984. I was born and raised in Toronto, and grew up and did my education in that there. And my first jobs were in the Toronto marketplace. I worked actually with Deloitte Haskins and Sells for a number of years, articling there in the CA profession. No real desires to be a CA, but I was certainly exposed to a many number of businesses. One of our clients happened to be Ampex, a name that you're probably pretty familiar with. In fact, for friends out there that you have and your listeners, they took a look at their old albums, from the 50s and 60s and flipped over the back, they'll see recorded on an Ampex 350 or a 351, and
Yeah.
used the tapes of a 406 and 456 are
Oh,
pretty
I'm
big.
very familiar with that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I worked with them for a number of years, and it was just a great opportunity for me. They were one of Deloitte's clients, and they turned to me and said, "Hey, would you come and help us? We're changing the management and come in and take over the financing and the what they called personnel at the time, that we all call HR today," which I did. And right place, right time, worked with a lot of really nice people. It was great. And then that morphed into going into the area of post-production, where we had supplied a lot of equipment. So I became a user of the equipment as opposed to a supplier in the area of post-production, wherein three of the Ampex guys left and went to Vancouver to set up an independent post-production facility. This need had, gone beyond waiting until after the 11 o'clock news to come in and use TV stations equipment to edit. And the West Coast was getting pretty much in demand. So I headed out west. That's how I got here.
Okay. And Vancouver became quite a film community. Some refer to it as Hollywood up north. It's on the West Coast. It's not that
It
far
really
from us.
did. And
Yeah.
I'm really proud to say, I mean, it's great sometimes when you don't know any better, but you got the gumption and you can deliver. It's amazing what you can do.
Hmm.
I was involved in the early days. As Peter Drucker said, from his days at Harvard and teaching and business, which I have a background in, is sometimes you got to take a courageous step moving forward. So we took our post-production facility, was primarily in the corporate, marketplace and commercial marketplace, and transitioned over to see what we could do in film and television, and worked alongside a lot of other people in other service sectors of the industry, such as the union workers, lawyers, all the necessary evils, accountants, and built an industry where we were able to serve the people that are interested in shooting here. The people come up from LA,
Yeah.
and instead of just shooting and shipping, maybe we could help them finish their product here and build an infrastructure around it. We were very successful in doing so. And when I left the industry directly, I'm still involved with it. We're over a $1 billion industry. Today, it's about $3 to $4 billion here in Vancouver. And we've also created a culture where we're producing our own stuff, not just, well, that's a nice artsy thing to do, but something that on an international basis is commercially viable. So I take my hats off to people in the
Mm.
industry.
Yeah.
The other really interesting thing that's happened here, John, is the spin-offs from the industry. And what do I mean by that? Particularly, I'll use an example in the area of animation. There are more animators in Vancouver than there are in LA now. And technology certainly has helped that too, in terms of, moving data around and doing work accordingly. So that's been a really interesting thing to see evolve here.
Yes, I've heard that. I've heard that there's a lot of animation that gets outsourced to Canada, and I think that's pretty cool. I think also Winnipeg is another hub for that sort of thing, graphic
Sure is.
design.
It's always been a neat art place in the world. In fact, one of my closest friends, she'll turn 90 this October. She
Mm.
lives in Los Angeles, originally from Winnipeg, worked with Disney's original Nine Old Men, if you will, on Snow White, and doing adaptations of it. And then she was involved with Roger Rabbit and did Roger Rabbit.
Hmm.
How we came to know each other was through the marketing initiatives we started in Vancouver, something I call Spread Your Own Rumors, where we invited people up from LA to Vancouver, had maybe an interest in working here or shooting here, and we would get them in our own backyard, and we developed a relationship. She happened to be one of those people on the trip, and we've been close friends ever since.
Excellent. Really cool. But however, instead of writing a book about post-production, which I could have written one too, but I didn't write one. I wrote books about mountain climbing because that was my passion, and of course music as well. You chose to write a book about music. Now everyone likes music, but you took it a step further. Talk about the book.
Well, it's interesting. Somebody said, "Well, what'd you write about this?" Well, I wrote about my escape, okay, about my hobby. I back in when I was born, and I child sort of in the 50s, but my parents were very young, but I was weaned on the music of the 50s. In fact, by the time I was 9 years old and 10, I could probably sing you every Platter song there ever was, because that's what was playing on in the house. But I really liked music, was very soothing for me. I didn't think about it so much at that time. It was just there because it was part of our family makeup. Come the early 70s, I was over and seeing my grandfather, and I'm going, I got to get a hobby. There he is, sitting in the living room, can't get out and do an oil change on the car, doesn't read, and he's fed up with the Toronto Maple Leafs at this stage. So he has no real interest. And I'm going, well,
Yeah,
I
I'm
can't
with
play
you.
baseball my whole life. I better find something that I like. And I started record collecting the 45s, and they constantly brought back little memories to me. I'd play the song, oh, I remember that dance I was at or whatever. But also, it was fairly eclectic what I liked, but I had to like it. And usually the old Dick Clark thing, it's got a good beat and you can dance to it, was one of my, things that moved me forward. So I just really became enamored with it and began, collecting records, primarily 45s, and because it told me a history about the music.
Hmm.
So I came along and I went, you know, imagine driving to work, or driving to school, and somebody could tell you some background on the songs. Now I got this from the idea from the legendary Paul Harvey. He used to have a syndicated show. He was out of Chicago, but he had a syndicated show across North America. In this case, it would go to CFRB in Toronto, which was a
Right.
big prominent station when I was there.
I
And he
know.
had a little segment every day called The Rest of the Story. And he had an unusual cadence. So his voice was captured, and he'd go page two, and then he'd go on and continue the story. But how he did it was in a form of somewhat of a mystery. He would tell you some information that you couldn't quite connect the dots with. Then they'd break for a commercial, and you'd stay for that commercial because he had you hooked. And then
Yeah.
after the commercial, he'd tell you the rest of the story. I remember one him doing on Abraham Lincoln. I was absolutely flabbergasted. So I'm thinking, imagine driving to work, to school, or driving home, and this segment comes on where the guy talks about an artist and a particular song, breaks to commercial, comes back, tells you the rest of the story, and plays the song. I mean, what a neat thing to do. It'd be a neat, but I even called back then moment in time, which is the title of my book.
Well, it's all stories. Life is stories, and you can break down any kind of situation. Style of music that I followed, in the 60s and 70s. I remember hearing the story, for instance, that Donovan was considered to be the lead vocalist for Led Zeppelin. Obviously,
Oh
that didn't
my.
work out. And I was wondering what kind of Led Zeppelin would have that sounded like, eh?
Well, no kidding.
Yeah.
What a difference that would be. And that timing aspect of that always fascinated me
Hmm.
about who did this. Even in the movie industry, somebody turned down a part, somebody else took it, and wow, and really, went with it.
Yep.
Happens all the time.
All the time.
Timing is a wonderful thing, and you have to make the most of your opportunities.
Yeah.
So
So,
when I
yeah.
moved out west, I got this idea. I said, and I ended up joining an international film group, which I'm still involved today, the International Quorum of motion picture producers. It's a worldwide organization. We're in about 47 countries in the world, and they're like a big family to me.
Hmm.
One of those members was in Nashville, Tennessee, still is. The company's called Film House. Now, what Film House did, their little niche in the marketplace at that time, was they did all the TV commercials for radio stations. You're probably familiar,
Okay.
hey, here's CKRF, or
Yeah, yeah,
whatever, and
sure.
blast it out. And they would do them in a way they could donut them and then, cut in the
Yeah.
various DJs they wanted in the group.
Hmm.
So his employees were former radio personnel, a lot of them, and his clients were obviously radio stations. So I produced a cassette, like that little, half inch, quarter-inch cassette,
Yep.
five demo ideas, got a DJ out here to do it, a la Paul Harvey, and I sent them to my friend there. And he said, the guys love the stories, but nobody wants sound bites today. No,
Mm,
this is the mid 80s. Everybody wants Dick Barclay's History of Rock and Roll or
mm.
Dick Clark's, you know, remember the records or Casey Kasem's Top
Oh
40.
yeah,
That
right. I
was
remember that. Yeah.
what they were looking for, so they could just plant those shows into their network whenever they had those spaces
Okay.
to draw the proper audience. So I took that back. So now we fast forward 13 years and it's 1997, and I'm sitting in the kitchen of a good friend of mine who was a former A&R director at A&M Records. His name is Michael Godin. Michael is responsible for discovering Bryan Adams, the Payolas, and a number of other groups, and had a great rapport with the people in the industry, extremely well respected. He ended up moving out to the West Coast to represent an artist by the name of Paul Jans. And down the line, he came to me, he said, Tom, I got another idea of how I want to move forward. I think this internet is going to take off. Now, remember, this is 1997. I said,
Sure.
it's a good bet. It
At that
will.
point in
And
time,
he
for
said,
sure.
I want to do an oldie show on that. I said, wow,
Okay.
how cool is that?
Like an online
So
radio show.
so he started the show called Treasure Island Oldies, and it's still on to this day. It's the longest running oldies show on the internet, 27 plus years now. It's on every Sunday night from 6 to 10 Pacific time, and he's on daily for 1 hour, all live from 11 a.m. to noon Pacific time. So do the math, 2 p.m.,
Hmm.
Eastern time. And he just loves doing it. It's giving back, and he's around the world with it. So in about 2000, I came to him. I said, Michael, I got an idea. What do you think about this for your show to make it a little unique? And so he started kicking around the idea of my little segments of moments in time. He says, I
Hmm.
love that.
Oh yeah.
I also at the time had a sponsor, so I could bring a sponsor
Hmm.
in with it. And he thought, well, that'll be great. That helps pay the freight on this. You know, let's do it. And so we started that off. The sponsor left, unfortunately, due to passing. Funny sidebar story. The
Hmm.
sponsor was a peanut butter company, named after a real live character from the film industry. His name was Sorrels Pickards. He was also a famous writer in Nashville. In fact, 4 of his records was on Ringo Starr's Beaucoup de Blues album. So this guy had some chops. So we had the Sorrels Pickards Gourmet Peanut Butter Pick of the Week. That was a tool for Michael
That's
every
a
week. I used
long
to get a
title.
kick out of listening to him, stumble through it the odd time.
Yeah.
Anyway, unfortunately, Soros passed, and the peanut butter company, ran its course. And so he said, but you know what? My audience are loving these. He said, so let's, as you discussed, there are moments in time. So that's how the moments in time piece started. So I've been writing those ever since, once a week. He does them live, on a show on Sunday nights. And it's been great. So then how does the book come about? Well, I got to thank COVID, because
Mm.
his listeners had always been bugging me. He said, Tom, you should put some of these things in a book. By then I'd written about 1,000 of these things. And I said, it's not a bad idea. I think I will do that. And so I started thinking about this 10 years ago, believe it or not.
Hmm.
But where am I going to find the time? So my consulting business, obviously everybody got consulting via Zoom, like we're today we're doing today,
Yeah.
because travel wasn't there. And all of a sudden I could move this from the corner of my desk to the front of it. And I said, geez, everything's written here. I just have to rearrange them, in book format.
Right.
And the big choice was, well, gosh, which 120 am I going to pick for the book out of the plethora that I had?
Okay.
So that was gave me the shot. And the other thing was that I knew that I had to do in this book was I had to obtain people's interest because I want them to read the book because this is really a disguised legacy book about the evolution of rock and roll. So two things kept in mind. A, who my target audience was, which is primarily people, in our vintage, in our target group. And two, one thing is for sure, whether you're young or old, our attention spans really got small. In other words, my comment from the past, sound bites
Yeah.
were in,
Okay.
right? And then the
Fantastic.
third part with my background and your appreciation of this in technology, how could I make this full circle? In other words, create instant gratification.
Hmm.
So that was my methodology going into writing the book. So what happens is when somebody picks up the book, I wrote them and I give credit to Paul, write them page on the right-hand page is the mystery. You turn the page over, you get the rest of the story. Then you go down in the left-hand corner and there's a QR code. You put your smartphone camera over it and you hear the song.
Yeah. What an experience. Excellent.
Yeah.
How do you put a QR code on a page?
Well, this is where I bow to I know enough to be dangerous. I know what they are. I mean, QR codes are around 10 years ago. They've almost been
Shh.
rebirthed
Yes.
because of COVID,
Right. Yeah.
So that was another good thing for my target group. They knew what they were
We
because
all
people
know what it
wrote in
is. Yeah.
menus and stuff like this. So it really is a one-time only piece that that they design and put in the mechanics behind it. And what it is it's a director. It's a one-time director, yeah, to a spot not there. Okay, and it's the simplest way, of putting it. And there's certain programming and stuff to do, which is, not my forte.
Okay.
But
So
that's
you,
basically how they work. So it's like the old thing, make it one touch, make it one piece, make it real
yeah.
easy for me. And that was the big thing to do. Everybody has smartphones today. See, if I wrote this 10 years ago, it wouldn't work. I may have
No,
had
no, of course.
include a CD in it, or who knows.
Yeah,
Would have
well,
been cool.
for those who are watching this and as curious about it as I am, and maybe want to do it, what's your advice? How, like you didn't do it yourself, fine, but
No,
what kind of company would one have
that's
to
it.
go to have
Well,
this
I
done?
have when I built a website for my piece. It's mitstories.com. I built that website for that. But my web guy, when I self-published this book, but I worked with people who were experienced in self-publishing, taught me a lot. And my designer knew about QR codes, and she would work with webmasters, if you will, in designing them. So my webmaster was very fluent in
Hmm.
QR codes, had done a lot of work for real estate companies.
Okay,
So
all right, okay. So
it
it's
was
that
a
kind of
nice,
person. So you
yeah,
approach somebody who's really, who works it
who's really
with
hip on
webs.
that and
Sure.
knows how to do it. That's how I did it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm really still hung up on the whole thing because I think it's the coolest thing I ever heard.
Well,
Was
there's my book is the only book I can say
that is
in the
so
music
cool.
world today that is done that way.
I can see an ebook doing that because you can touch it and click and go to a link and all that. Oh, okay. So I've got a bunch of questions, but I'll just.
Sure.
So, is it expensive to do that?
Not really. I had a budget when I went through that, but to put all that together was all part of the package, and
Okay,
it was
sure.
one of the sells, if you will, by the designer. Say, hey, I'll do your book design for this. You can do this for this. I can put in QR codes, and here's your package. So it all came together. If you were just doing it separately, I don't think that's the way to go because you need this interaction between
Yeah.
your web guys and your book guys, because I could also carry that to the website as well.
Okay. I'm wondering if more of these hybrid publishers are going in that direction and making
Yeah.
connections with people who can do things like this.
Yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
think go out and get the quotes, and there's so many great people out there in the marketplace, and the cost, doing this. I mean, building a website, as short as 5 or 6 years ago was expensive. Today, I mean, you could build your own if you're so inclined. but there's people out there who can do that for you, and you just got to put your time value of your time,
Mhm.
vis-a-vis the cost and what it is moving forward.
Yeah, that time that you're investing, that's my next and final question on the QR code.
Yeah,
Because music is very particular, when you're talking about a tune that you're, let's Bill Haley in the comments, Rock Around the Clock. I'm sure
yeah.
it's in your book. So which version are you going for, and what platform are you aiming it at? Spotify, YouTube, what?
No, that's a great question. So first off, Uh, I'm a big purist about the original, or I'll tell a story about a song that maybe the original wasn't a hit, but here's the hit we know, but
Okay.
they got the rest of the story, how the one that's popular to you and I
Yeah.
know, so you do it. Now, the key about it is with the QR code, all I do, it's just a pointer, no more, no less. There's nothing saved anywhere. It's just a pointer and it just points to YouTube. That's where it goes.
So the technician who takes over from your work knows that's where you want it to go, and then
Yeah,
creates
yeah,
the QR
yeah,
code.
yeah, and yeah.
Fascinating. I think that's just a brilliant thing, and I want you to sell many of these books.
Well,
Let's talk about
thank-
let's talk about the book itself. It's broken down into 50s, 60s, and 70s for fans
yeah,
of music. Now, during those decades, there was many different types of music, and I've been playing music for a long time. When I have friends of mine my age says, well, the 70s were really the best, and nothing's better than the 70s. And then I start listing a bunch of bands from the 70s or artists. Says, well, do you like this person? No, I don't like that. No, because I know they don't like those artists. So I don't think I've never been the one who thinks, well, this decade was good because it's just good. So
mm,
when you're picking songs, say, let's start with the 50s.
mhm.
Would you agree that the 50s music was the first time that the industry was catering towards this new thing called teenagers? Because in the 40s, I don't think they really were doing that. Am I wrong?
No. I mean, in the 40s, they were, following in mom and dad's footsteps, with the big band era and
Hmm.
stuff like that.
Yeah.
Come the 50s, things started to open up. The economy also opened up a lot too after the World War. Teenagers were a little more affluent there. They had some money, as
Yeah.
well in their pieces. And then the proliferation of radio stations was big. And on air, and to be able to listen to rhythm and blues never before, or pick it up at nighttime, from
Yeah.
some station, and who were playing those with transistor radios evolving and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It was the kids, playing this stuff, and the guys I take my hat off to, the true vehicles or the catalysts for this music were those early DJs. I mean, they were the rebels in the marketplace. They'd be out there playing stuff and getting, hailed with bullets from their employer
That
saying,
was
"Hey, you
Wolfman
don't play
Jack
that
was
stuff."
one of them, wasn't he?
Wolfman Jack was I would call him second generation. If you went back to the
Yeah.
first guys, certainly, Alan Freed, Dewey Phillips out of Memphis was huge. Jocko Henderson, he played at Baltimore, in New York. You had Hunter Hancock in L.A.
Mm.
Bill Randall was another guy out of Cleveland. There's about seven of them. There's another Mary Jean the Queen Steinberg. She was amazing. She was out of Atlanta and ended up in Detroit right through the 60s and that. She was a pretty amazing DJ, and a woman too, she was pretty phenomenal. So, and then if you went to Pittsburgh, you could probably walk down the street and say the name Porky Chedwick. Everybody know who you're talking about. But it'd be like walking in Vancouver and saying Red Robinson. Everybody knows who you're talking about. If you're in Toronto, you'd say Duff Roman. These guys are regional stars. They're mega stars. In fact, they're more popular even to the acts that came into town than they were. Uh, but they were only, other than Freed, went a little more national than everybody else. The guys that came after them, the Dick Clarks and that, thanks to television, got that expanding media. So they got recognized. And then the Wolfman did it really interesting because he did it out of Mexico, came
Okay.
forward with it, and then ended up in New York going head to head against Cousin Brucey. So this evolution of these guys was fascinating to me. In fact, I'm working on a piece right now, and as I said, I'm still involved in the film industry, executive producing a piece that I created on the evolution of rock and roll as seen through the eyes of these renegade DJs.
Okay.
because it is a true story. And it wasn't about um, black, I mean, it and white. This was music was probably one of the first, when you think about it, integrators. You know, they're just
I agree.
playing music that the people on that their listeners wanted to hear. They didn't know if their listeners are black and white. In fact, some of the listeners didn't know that Alan Freed, for example, was white. They didn't care though. That wasn't the key. It was all about the music. Okay. And it was the establishment above that extra layer above that had that challenge. Then you
Yeah.
talked about, the teenager, and then the dance crazes start to come on, and that led to a little people just weren't quite ready for that integration on the dance
No,
floor.
there were some problems associated with that, but positive
Mm.
people like you and I look at it as a good thing, but there's always voices of dissent for sure.
Back then, they did. I mean, even the expression rock and roll is relatively, new back then. They weren't quite sure what that, thing
Hmm.
was. It got sort of coined by Freed and pushed it, and then it started to expand. Yeah, it was really a different time. I mean, my dad, case in point, remember the TV guides? It used to come out and
Yeah.
you go through
Yeah.
you had to buy your weekly TV guide to see what was on.
Yeah.
And he goes, so these are TV guides from the mid to late 50s. And I remember him opening up. He goes, "Ed Sullivan. Okay, let's see who's coming to the circus tonight." Because Elvis Presley got
Right.
on. So
Yeah.
you had that type of backlash for
You
sure.
did for sure. I mean, I did at least, and I saw it around me. But that was
Yeah,
the 60s.
yeah.
The 50s, though, seemed very innocent, or at least, on the surface. We had Sam Cooke, for instance,
Oh man,
and
yeah.
he appealed to the white audiences. And I remember reading something about how the black audiences saw him as a sellout. Did
Yeah.
you? Yeah, yeah.
Some
So
of
that,
them did because his music was so commercial and it started sounding like what white artists would sing. So that
yeah.
was one of the challenges. But he was just a different approach. I always remember James Brown's quote
Hmm.
about Sam Cooke. James Brown says he was probably one of the most amazing guys I ever learned of. Now, James Brown was always known as the hardest working man in rock and roll. I think we've
Yeah,
all
yeah.
seen his performance on stage at the Cape and the whole 9 yards. He says, I go out dancing my bloody brains off. Sam Cooke comes out and just moves his hands, and he's got the whole audience in a trance.
Yeah.
That was the magic of Sam Cooke. That's why he sold to him. And he wasn't a threat. He didn't appear to be a threat. And the White House, took it in. I also believe bad news sells newspapers. So just because some people thought he was a sellout, I still think that's a minority group, but it got attention.
Yeah, I
That's
agree.
my humble opinion.
Yeah. And then the whole incident with Chuck Berry, and he was rock and roll. He was rock and roll through and through.
Yeah.
And there was some racism that befell him as well, and he got into all kinds of trouble.
Well,
And
he did. It's funny you bring up Chuck. I just finished reading a biography done on him, done by a guy from England who is very thorough. It's one of the best ones I ever read. I mean, his challenges with the gal coming across the state line and the Mann Act and being, nailed with that. I mean, he sometimes Chuck was his own worst enemy because he got a little aloof about how he wanted to defend himself. But a multi-talent. I mean, you talk to the Stones, you talk to the Beatles, that he was an influencer. There's just no question about
yeah,
it. But you bring up an interesting thing. So I'm going to take you back about the switchover because I find this very interesting. To me, when as rock and roll was starting in the 50s, it had a real feel, a real energetic thing, feeling, and totally different in the 40s. So you could understand the threat felt by the established people or older people or parents and that.
yeah,
Then all of a sudden it gets really homogenized comes the early 60s. Well, why did that happen? Well, I'll tell you why. It's very simple. Chuck Berry has his challenges, no question. Jerry Lee Lewis gets into big trouble, which, he was at the top of his game. He goes to England, introduces everybody to his 13-year-old cousin, who's his wife now. So that's
hmm,
sort of pretty well, kiboshed is here. Little Richard says, hey, you know what? I'm going. I'm back to the church. I'm going to pick up my Bible. So he trades his piano in for
right,
a Bible.
yeah,
Um, Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's marketing guy, real smart guy. And with all the commotion and stuff, gets Elvis. you know, he goes into the army.
Yep.
Okay. And then the kicker is on February 3rd, 1959, often referred to as the day the music dies.
Yeah.
Buddy Holly,
I was
Richie
going to say
Valens,
that.
and the Big Bopper's gone. So
Yeah.
all this stuff compacted in the last part of the 50s. And then the payola scandal starts to raise
Right.
its ugly head out of Florida. So, and then top 40 radio comes in. Now that's very significant because in the stations, programmers were telling the DJs what to play. All of a sudden, that renegade spirit was gone. I could play
Hmm.
what I wanted to play. So it gets a little softer. In fact, in my new book I'm writing, I have a thing called the Bobby era and talking about all these Bobbies that came in their early 60s. I'm not saying they weren't talented, but there was about 14 or 15 of them during that period of time. And the music was almost homogenized. It was cut down, didn't have the raw factor as in the past. And it was what the girl groups came into play. And all of a sudden, there was a controlling of rock and roll
There was.
until the British invasion.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's so much to talk about. Let's move into the 60s. But before we um, do you write about Buddy Holly and the Crickets playing the Apollo? I mean, that was
Yeah,
something else.
I know that story well, and I did. I mean, they were shocked, but that gets back to my other point. They just wanted the music, right?
Yeah,
Buddy
yeah.
Holly struck a chord with all audiences because
It's a
he was
beautiful,
he was so
beautiful story.
innovative. He's one of my favorite artists
Hmm.
of all time. His non-hits are good. You know,
Yeah, a lot of fun. So the 60s. The
Mm,
teenagers now are university students, young adults, and some of them have, learned about the world a little bit more, and it's not as beautiful and a place as they thought it perhaps was when they were in the happy days. And so music took on a different swing and went into a different direction. But also, you talked about the music getting softer. Let's talk about things like the Wrecking Crew and how
oh
music
yeah,
was being produced.
yeah, yeah.
Totally different.
Well, you're not kidding. I mean, the well, Carol Kay, by the way, who was in the Wrecking Crew, she was a bass player in the Wrecking
Hmm.
Crew.
I know all about them. Yeah, they're great.
She just turned 89
Yeah, she's amazing.
years old, and she was amazing. So the Wrecking Crew, and you had guys like Glenn Campbell, was in that as well. There's the two names that always pop into my mind, and I forget the drummer's name, but he was fantastic. The the interesting thing was like if even all those, when surfing music sort of came in as an offshoot, the Beach Boys going on, their first stuff, it was the Wrecking Crew,
Yes.
that
Yeah.
pretty produced all that stuff and just came up with that beautiful sound. I mean, they really were incredible. They're on so many records that people don't know, but they didn't care. Where the challenge came
Hmm.
was when the groups went on tour afterwards, whether it be the
Right. And
Vic Park
they
Caravan.
couldn't produce it.
Hey, that doesn't sound the same as
Right.
that. And but this continued to happen. It wasn't the first time that happened. I still laugh at being at the Junos in 1989, 90, and we were there. And that was the year, if you remember the story about Milli Vanilli, they get the number
Oh,
one
yeah.
Grammy, the
Right,
whole thing.
right.
They're getting recognized for an international junior award at the
And they
at the
can't sing.
Junos. And so I'm there with Michael Godin from A&M, and we're sitting there and we're going, and they come out on the stage to perform. He goes, "Geez, that just doesn't sound like the record." He said, "Well, the sound might be off in here." Meanwhile, the band comes on, kicks it, it's all good, and all the other artists they had on are great. So it was about 2 months afterwards we found out the story. Here was a situation where session musicians, made it all happen,
Yeah,
and these guys were sort of, but not great frontmen, unfortunately, and
yeah.
they couldn't pull it off.
Interesting. Well, I remember when, we were talking about the 50s and
Hmm.
how people were playing their instruments. There was nobody not playing their instruments, but then it got sanitized for all the reasons that you gave, and that's all
Yeah.
good. And we went back to, it seems like a roller coaster ride with music because a similar thing happened when punk rock at the end of 70s says, no, we're gonna make this all bare bones, and yeah, it was okay, but then it sort of petered out. And by the
Yeah.
time we hit the 90s, it's just my opinion at least, that music started entering that sanitized phase again. Although
Yeah,
they were doing it much better this time,
yeah.
but they were showing us that no, this is a business and we're not going to put up with all this nonsense of people throwing televisions out windows and, you know,
Yeah,
you,
I
you,
mean, like sanitize industry's word that for me, like in the 80s, really starting was synthesized. I mean, the synthesizer took over,
well, I was
everything.
referring to the 90s, the beginning of the 90s when
Yeah, made in the
we were
90s. Yeah,
throwing all that junk out and now we're going to give you Amanda Marshall and things like that, which
yeah,
was fine, but
and you can tell the difference.
yeah.
I agree with you. I'm with you 100% on that. And that's why I like going to hear people play unplugged. I'm
Hmm.
actually going to go see Dan Hill, but he'll play unplugged. And
Yeah.
I know it'll be great because it's about him and certainly the music and the lyrics, but it's not about I'll use the word event. It's not about the
Yeah.
full presentation, right?
Right.
So I think
Well,
they got caught up
just
in it. I agree with you. They
yeah,
went
just to
overboard.
complete my thought,
Yeah.
then we ended up with things like American Idol and The Voice, and to me, that's not really music. These people are very talented, certainly, but
Yeah.
I don't look at that the same way. Like, oh, it's really catching my heart. I really feel it inside. It's just done very well, and I guess it's a
Mm,
contest, and then they have a winner, and I really don't care personally.
yeah. Yeah. I think it was one of those things that, people jumped on it because it was new and it was different. And I think now it's sort of you don't have that spark anymore.
No, it's gone. Yeah,
It's what I'm hearing from you. And so, what's the next thing, needs to, to be done? It needs to be looked at. I'm not sure what that is.
yeah,
I mean, it's wonderful today, here before back in the 50s, 60s, before top 40 guys could literally go around the stage schlepping their 45s, hoping the guy will play it and passing it around. And today, what are they doing now? They're putting them on YouTube to see if they can get a number of hits
yeah,
so that they're strong enough. So maybe somebody may want to see them perform. So it's gone a different way. It's not about selling the records, it's about selling them
sure.
as an entity.
Absolutely, I agree. I'm an eternal optimist, I have to admit. So I think that despite all that, there is good music. Maybe we just have to dig deeper for it. You have to really mine for it and find it somewhere. But it's out
That's
there.
true. I also think there's a lot of music that we're exposed to. I mean, I spend a lot of my time on looking for regional hits. Like, here's the number one record that came out of Detroit, just use an example, right?
Okay.
And I hear this, I'm going, wow, why didn't that make it? From the late 50s, early 60s.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of them didn't have Elvis Presley's Tom Parker, that's for sure. And
Yeah.
they got into the studio, scraped some money together, and then had a $1.37 to go out and market the vehicle. I mean, that's a tough sled, to make it happen. So those those independent labels, because most of them are independent labels, which proliferated in order to get music out and pressed, but they didn't have the backup or the marketing machine, that the bigger ones did, like the RCA's, the Columbia's did at that time.
Hmm.
So hence, you didn't hear the pieces. But I assure you, uh, I can play some records for you and go, man, that should have been a hit,
Yeah.
and why wasn't it? So I find that extremely fascinating, but that is part of the story of the evolution of rock and roll.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in the 60s and I loved music. I had a little transistor radio. My father bought me, had it to my ears. And I bought the 45s. They were 10 cents a piece, if I remember correctly. And my sister's 5 years older than me. So here we still we talk regularly. She lives in Quebec. And I bring up this story, but remember when I used to perform for you? This is before I started playing music, and I put on the 45 and I would lip sync using the curtain string had a little weight at the bottom, and that was my microphone. And I want to dance for her and sing, Band of Gold by Frida Payne
Okay.
or Games People Play, Joe South, things like that. The one-hit wonders. Let's talk about one-hit wonders. There was plenty of
Yeah.
them in the 60s.
Yep. Oh, yeah. There was lots of them. And sometimes there's a bit of a misnomer. It may have been one hit wonder, on Billboard. It made, but they had a plethora of other records that may have been regional hits, and somebody picked one up and it went forward. But there are lots of the one hit one. In fact, I think one hit wonders are probably more the norm than not. I mean,
Yeah.
successful groups like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Bee Gees, and that. you can in the Rascals, you can count them on one hand, maybe two, right? But for every one of those, there's about 100 other ones who had their 15 minutes of fame,
Hmm.
in the marketplace. So yeah, one hit wonders have always been a very big interest to me. In fact, I have a whole book just on one hit wonders that I
Yeah,
often,
I like
use
one hit.
research from because I find those stories fascinating and sometimes they're tragic. Like a guy have a story had a one hit look like he could be really coming on, and he passes on, and but nobody really knows that because they don't know anything about him. Just know that this guy had a record back then. So that type of thing happened a lot as well,
Hmm.
unfortunately.
Hmm. I don't think it's possible to talk about the 60s music without mentioning the Beatles. And so I guess my question is, I'm sure you did talk about them. What effect did they have on other musicians who up till that point were topping the charts and along come these guys and stealing the show? Did that actually happen?
Well, it did. I mean, these guys come along, and it was like wow. And but what it did in America, and I'll give you two examples off of that. What it did in America, when people are hearing the Beatles coming on and they're hearing their stuff they're doing, and then they're getting in a little deeper about America and what influenced the Beatles. Ringo Starr will tell you that when he was inducted in the Hall of Fame, what encouraged him was he would go over to his friend's house and, at 11, 12 years old, and he turned on Radio Luxembourg, which is sort of like a pirate radio station back then, and he'd hear an Alan Freed show and be hearing these guys like Jerry Lee Lewis and Little Richard and stuff and go, wow, that's the sound I want. So that sound was implanted in them. And when you talk to the Beatles, they'll go back to the Chuck Berrys, the Jerry Lee Lewis's, the Little Richards, all the time that really pushed them forward. Through the Beatles, through the Beatles, America rediscovered the roots of rock and roll. Same with the Stones as well, and even the
Interesting.
Animals. I mean, I think the Animals were like sort of one step ahead in terms of heavy R&B based on trying to compare "She Loves You" with the House of the Rising Sun. I don't
Mm.
get. I'll listen to the House of Rising Sun. But it's just fuller. The lyrics, it's just where it was for me. And Eric Bird and the Animals really picked up on that. But again, they went back to the American roots. That's what motivated them moving forward. So they had tremendous impact. Now, to further answer your question, in the mid 60s, the girl groups are toast. Like nobody, unfortunately, it's tough, hang. Other than the Supremes, thanks to the Motown machine, kept going and talented. Don't get me wrong, they're totally talented. So there was room for that Motown dynamic in there. But the other guy were struggling. The Beach Boys managed to get through, but somebody else had to come up, with a new angle. So is there an antithesis group, moving forward? Well, there was. Paul Revere and the Raiders.
Oh, I
They
like them. Yeah.
yeah, they're good, but they were sort of they come out, they're dressed in the American outfits
Yeah,
and they
they're
sing,
funny. Yeah.
so that was sort of a little cross thing. But my favorite, to me, one of the most underrated groups from the 60s, although they did get their recognition and are in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame right now. They came out um, real prominent use of the organ and back to that soul blues and creating their own thing was the Rascals. I mean, I'm a big fan of Felix Cavaliera and the Rascals.
Yeah.
They were terrific,
Hmm.
and
And
they
here,
were an offshoot of that.
here in Canada, we had well, April Wine, I guess, began in the late 60s. And the
Great, yeah,
Stampeders out of Alberta.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I think the evolution, it happened in Toronto, from the days just prior to that, the Toronto Sound and that creation of that type of group. A guy by the name of David Clayton Thomas was with a
Oh, yeah.
group called the Shays and the Bossmen. Of course, he becomes the lead guy for Blood, Sweat, and Tears. He
Right.
comes out of there.
Yeah.
John Kay was with a group called the Sparrows
That's right.
here.
Oh, geez.
John
For
Kay
sure.
becomes Steppenwolf right
Hmm.
now. So the Canadian scene music really started to develop at a high international acceptable level was there. And then of course the Guess Who,
Oh, yeah.
phenomenal. And then
Yeah.
BTO. I mean, so we got a lot to be proud of here in this
Mm,
country.
yeah, for sure. For sure. Now, it seems that, you reminded me in 1959, the date of music died. And 10 years later, we have Woodstock, which in my opinion was a bit of a disaster. They tried to do it the next year at Altamont. That was a total disaster.
Yeah,
Hendrix died. Janis Joplin was gone. Mama Cass, I think, choked on some chicken bone or something.
yeah,
Art Linkletter's daughter fell out of a window. It was, yeah, drugs like in the Nixon, and
yeah.
everything changed again. So
I
now we're
changed
into the
again.
70s,
Yeah.
and things like the Wrecking Crew and other record companies, house bands, were out of work because bands insisted to play their own music and their own instruments. What kind of stuff do you cover in the 70s as a result of all
Well,
that turbulence?
it's interesting because some of them, people, there was a bit of a free spirit, that was going on. And one of my great examples of a free spirit who stayed away from all that, and yet she could have been bigger, but nobody bought into it. But she was one of your one-hit wonders. But there was a gal, and totally respected by the industry, by the way, and still around today. Her name was Shy Coltrane, Chi Coltrane, no relation to John Coltrane, by
Okay.
the way. But she had a record called Thunder and Lightning. If you ever see her perform, on the stage, she got to, I think, about 21 on the Billboard charts. She was fantastic, but she was her own person. Jerry Lee Lewis was proud of her. He thought she was fantastic. Good looking gal, could play the piano, great voice, but she was her own. She wasn't selling out. She was doing her own thing, but not punk, not nothing. But I bring it up because she ended up sort of being a one-hit wonder in terms of people knowing about it. But the whole point is there were these things happening on. So what else was going on, at that time? You get towards the Senate, and then this whole what was called the underground movement, and a lot, and in the
Yeah.
gay community, for example, would go under and listen to music that they could get out, dance to, be themselves,
Hmm.
and felt protected, or
Sure.
okay. But that evolved into the disco sound,
That's right.
and
Yeah.
that became the disco sound. And the disco sound is fascinating. Um, wasn't type music, but it still answered the same thing for teenagers. Remember, there's teenagers in the 50s, there's teenagers in the
It's always
60s, there's
teenagers.
teenagers
Yeah,
in the
for sure.
70s. I want to get out and dance. It's got a good beat, I can dance to it.
Hmm.
So whammo, they do it. Saturday Night Fever comes, then the whole world is cool. Everybody's involved. The young adults are
That's
involved.
right. Yeah.
No different than the twist going, into the nightclubs in New York, and then the young adults are, into the twist, and
Yep.
Joey D and the Starlighters are, playing at the Peppermint Lounge, but and that's for people not teenagers, it's
Even
older.
yeah.
So the same thing happens again in the 70s, only with a different thing. It's fascinating, what happened at that time, and then the whole backlash. You talk about the backlash of, hey, did um our friend Sam Cooke sell out? And then you got the backlash in the 70s, disco sucks, right? So you have, in the 70s, and it sort of runs its course in the late
Yep.
80s. Regardless of the fact it hit, and you can ask the Bee Gees because they were the number one group of the 70s, and rebirthed their whole career
Yep.
was through that, and all the records that they wrote for Saturday Night Fever was phenomenal, and
Yep.
people get vision. You shut your eyes, you see Travolta walking down the street with the strut, and everybody, when you talk to people about it, that's one of the first things that come up. So it was an extremely visual adaptation for music,
Yeah.
is what I look at the 70s like.
Right. So that's mainly your focus of the 70s. Do you talk about the progressive rock movement, the art rock movement, or heavy metal when it started
Yeah, yeah,
basically with
but
Black Sabbath,
but
I
there's
guess, in
also,
1978?
some of the one-hit wonder ones, like the guys are listening to this stuff, and like in that book, a specific one, these guys are sitting around one day. I love this story, and he goes, I can write that, and he pulls out his guitar and he just plays a riff. So that night, his partner goes back, hey, what do you think about these lyrics? Let's put them together. He said, this will probably commercially sell. I said, oh yeah, okay, we'll cut it. They cut it, and it's one of the biggest hits ever. They're only one hit record, and it was the Sanford Townsend Band doing Smoke from a Distant Fire, which
Hmm.
a song I totally like, but they
Yeah.
did it, just, hey, I could write that,
Right.
type of approach. So I guess the rest of that era. you know, was in a sense impressionable even amongst the people that were there. Hey, I'm not disco, but I'm going to do this because I think
Hmm.
it's gonna fit. But I can take a few riffs from that and see if I can put this out.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, you got a changing folk scene going on. The folk scene hangs in. I mean, it's amazing. It's not so heavy drug oriented as it was. I mean, the summer of '67, the summer of love. I mean, yikes, that was something else. And you know, of course, you get groups like Procol Harum, you know, the whiter shade of pale,
Yeah.
and everybody's into that song, but nobody yet can really tell me what those lyrics mean.
That's
You know,
right.
but
Well,
people bought into it.
I remember showing my son when he was a teenager a video of Monterey Pop Festival where Hendrix burns his guitar and his jaw dropped. He's like, "Why are they doing this?" You know? Yeah,
Yeah.
that was a turning point.
Yeah,
But
yeah, and Peter Townsend went through quite a few guitars, I
oh,
think, in his
he's
day on
ridiculous.
stage
He
with
still
that
does
little.
it. He's an old man. He's still smashing up Gibson J200s like they're like, nothing.
Yeah, well, they
I
are
can't
nothing
stand
to
watching
him. It's
that.
all relative, I guess.
I don't like watching that stuff.
No, me
Don't break
neither.
your guitar. Give your guitar to somebody who could use it.
You know, I like the old clips. I actually, I don't know if you have, but a guy named Salt bought out all the rights to all the Ed Sullivan shows in the U.S. And
Hmm.
on MeTV, he's taken these shows and he's condensed them down into half hours. And he's even themed some of them where he'll have when it's just all singing groups because he realized kicking and screaming that he had to bring some of the current talent on to hit the teenage audience for a show starting in the mid to late 60s with Elvis Presley. And
Yeah.
then he would introduce a group on the show. I bring it up because I love watching those shows because it's not overproduced. I hate stuff that's overproduced
Yeah.
and images coming over my head and stuff. I just want to see the person sing the song that I know. I don't even care if it's lip sync. It's just a real fond memory of how I grew up with
Hmm.
that record. He does it incredibly well and
Yeah.
even keeps in the Ed Sullivan bloopers, which
Oh,
puts a
cool.
smile on my face
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah. We used to sit around and watch the Ed Sullivan Show. It was
Oh, we all
always
did.
fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Please tell me about your hat.
Okay. Oh,
That's cool hat.
thank you. Well, as you can see, a lot of people don't know what it is, but for the people that don't, that was the center we used to use to play our 45s on a record player because this 45s have a big hole in them. This was the piece that fit into that hole. You put them on the record player and play it. This particular hat comes from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland. I had cause to be down there, and I was meeting with the president and CEO down there, and I walked through the gift shop afterwards, and my wife says, "Look at this hat." She says, "That's you." So I bought it, and we took it from there. That night, I'm a big baseball fan, and we went to see the Cleveland Indians at the time play at the park, and they were playing the White Sox, and there's a guy I wanted to see him play against. So anyway, we're sitting there. This older gentleman comes up to me and he goes, "Hey, I know what that is. Not too many people do." And I said, "Yeah, you're right." And I said, "I guess I'm showing my age." And he says, "So, are you a Mason?" And I just started laughing because he thought this is amazing. This is one of
Yeah.
their
Right. Yeah.
secret album. So I play along with him. Yeah, it is. You figured out the maze and all this stuff. My wife pounded me in the side and she says, "Let this go." And so I did. So the guy walked away. I never gave him the satisfaction to tell
That's
him what
right.
he said. I didn't want to embarrass him, make him feel wrong.
Sure. Yeah. That's
Well, I
funny.
guess I'm an honorary Mason. I don't know.
I guess so. Yeah. So I'm going to put you full frame and you can give a pitch to this book, this wonderful
Oh, wow.
sounding book, Moments in Time. Let us know why people should order this book.
Great. Okay, will do. The book, we got to understand my motivation for writing the book. And the big thing was, yeah, I had the time during the COVID period, but I was getting a little grumpy back then. I'm a pretty upbeat, optimistic guy like yourself, John. And it was time to put a smile back on people's faces. What puts a smile on people's faces? I found every time I talked to music of people, they would get into it. You could see their eyes lit up and a big smile on their face. So I said, you know what? We got to put something out. More importantly, we cannot lose the story about the evolution of rock and roll. So I created Moments in Time, and it's basically stories about artists and songs of the 50s, 60s, and 70s that we grew up with. Remembering it's for music fans from a music fan. That's all I am, is a real music fan. But I think this should be shared. So that was sort of my purpose in life in doing it. The book has done extremely well. It's won 4 or 5 awards. It resides in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland in 2 areas, their gift shop, and it's also a reference book in their library and archives. It's used as by reference books by DJs who are in the oldies marketplace in the US, and I've made a great relationship with them moving forward. And it's also available on Amazon worldwide, and fortunate received some pretty good ratings from them. So I encourage people to buy, especially if you're a music lover, to have a reference book of your own and share some fond memories for yourself and your family.
Well said. Well said. Excellent. And maybe I'll order one too, because obviously I would be into something like that. And the QR code thing, I just got to see that. I just got to get my smartphone and do that. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
Well, Tom, it's been a delight talking to you about your passion, which we share the same passion. You just happen to write a book about it, and I think it's wonderful.
Thank you.
All
Thank
right.
you very much.
Well, you take care of yourself now.
You too, sir. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for watching. If you like what I do here on Tell Me About Your Book, then please consider hitting that like button and leaving a comment. You can also subscribe and ring that bell, because I release 2 episodes per week, one on Wednesdays and one on Saturdays. And if you are an author, I would love to hear from you. Until such time, keep on writing and be kind to one another.